What's always a good indicator of when music changes the way it sounds? Sometimes you don't have to think beyond simply switching the calendar from one decade transition to the next. December 31st, 1989, January 1st, 1990. I'll talk more about that inside. Hey everybody, it's Michael Douglas. Welcome back to Dr. Punter, where we talk about music, not medicine. And I want to talk about three songs from 1988, not 1989, although I could have, that I think demonstrate that music in the 1980s, the way the arrangements were, the melodies, beats, were radically changing, and it set the stage for the way pop music sounded, at least in the early 90s. The transition between the 1980s sonically and the 1990s, I think, was most crucial in the last 18 months of the decade of the 1980s, where you had different styles such as New Jack Swing, a lot of more percussion-heavy beats, a lot more repetitive dance beats, and a lot more percussion instrumentation than you had when the 1980s dawned. In the 1980s, pop music was still reeling over the effects of disco music in the late 1970s, and pop was struggling to kind of gain a foothold. And that's when melodies, I think, predominated more than they did in the late 1980s. That would be a topic for another show, but I want to talk about three songs from 1988 that maybe were on the cusp of that trend that inevitably bled into the 1990s in terms of the sonic evolution of most pop music. And it's always interesting to see how sounds change when a decade is coming to an end. When artists can feel one era concluding and another just beginning, something happens. You can hear that. You may not be able to put your finger on it, but you can hear it. Vibes and feelings begin to kind of shift toward the unknown. And I think that's exactly what happened in the summer toward the fall of 1988, where this shift had its real genesis in the 1980s. And I wanted to explore three pop songs from that era in 1988, and I want to remember their power, basically. And these three tracks, when we listen to them today, I think continue to impress me with their musical construction and arrangements. And these are also three songs that hint on the then oncoming 1990s that still are very definitive and can quite literally, at least for those who think about music like I do, stop us in our tracks and say, yep, music was really changing when this particular song was on the airwaves. First up, You Got It, The Right Stuff by New Kids on the Block. This is a song on their second album, Hangin' Tough, that thrust them into superstardom that only lasted, the biggest peak they had was probably about 2 years, from the moment the song was released in mid-1988 to the summer of 1990 when they released Step by Step. And New Kids on the Block set the standard by which I think boy bands were presenting themselves, their melodies, their harmonies, for the next, say, 15 to almost 20 years. Definitely 15 years. And people have often said that New Kids on the Block walked so that NSYNC or even the Backstreet Boys could run. Indeed, the 1980s, way before Justin Timberlake and all the fellas and Backstreet Boys, it was New Kids on the Block, NKOTB, who were just wowing young fans. It was their posters in the 1980s that kids had up in their bedroom walls, and it was all thanks to songs like You Got It, The Right Stuff. Catchy numbers that when you heard them once, you never forgot them. That's pop music, and it sticks with you for a lifetime, and it definitely presaged the influence that boy bands had in this country throughout the decade of the 1990s and early 2000s. A great example. And this song was so much of a success for the group, well, the record company started to mine its first album for songs, and you began to see tracks released alongside the Hangin' Tough tracks. Probably the best example of this is their Delphonics remake of Didn't I Blow Your Mind? a song that was from their previous album before Hangin' Tough that became a top 10 hit with the concurrent release of a track called Cover Girl. So that's a little of an aside there. So the next song that I want to talk about is probably the most complete pop song in this list. And it was from a young Paula Abdul. I'm talking about her massive, successful #1 hit, Straight Up. The former Lakers girl, Paula Abdul, turned her success dancing and choreographing moves on the court during timeouts and into a pop career that spanned decades, of course, leading up to what she's probably most often known for, and that's her stint on American Idol as one of the 3 initial judges for that TV show. And she was one of the it people in Hollywood at the end of the 1980s, bringing a sense of dance and fun to mainstream culture. And this, I think, influenced, say, Janet Jackson, who this song's release predated her Rhythm Nation album by about a year. And I think this is an example of a good influence that Paula Abdul had on that particular album that really carried pop music, pop R&B music into the early 1990s from the late 1980s. Just a great time to enjoy pop music. And what she learned about entertaining from the Showtime LA basketball team, she brought to pop music in 1988. This song set off a string of top 10 hits for Paula Abdul. Yes, she may have had a short-lived run at musical fame, but it propelled her into the national spotlight for at least 20 years. But it also was responsible, I think, for the rapid shift in pop toward dance pop that was so prevalent in the early 1990s. Way to go, Paula. Finally, the New Jack Swing movement, I think, in terms of mainstream acceptance of this popular form of R&B music that had been out for about a year or so before mid-1988 on mostly R&B stations, began to bleed into pop music consciousness with Bobby Brown. No matter what you think of the guy, I think he alone was instrumental in bridging that crossover of New Jack Swing to the pop charts. Yes, there are other acts that followed. Of course, his prerequisite namesake band, New Edition, that had their own New Jack Swing album out, Heartbreak, around that time. Bobby Brown, of course, wasn't part of that group at the time, but he still definitely was associated with that group in spirit and would go on to kind of do some reunion work with the band in about a decade or so after that. But the song that really went viral before being viral was a thing was My Prerogative. That song went all the way to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and was the follow-up to the top 10 hit Don't Be Cruel, the song that really set the stage for that incredibly successful album by Bobby Brown. And My Prerogative, this pretty much cemented that into pop consciousness. And I think it was because of this track that mainstream pop radio really embraced at least the most popular New Jack Swing tracks in the final year and a half of the 1980s. And the song, I think, that had the vocabulary on the lips of millions of tongues, the word prerogative. Bobby Brown taught people what that term meant. And all of a sudden, everywhere you looked in the late 1980s, people were saying, my prerogative this, my prerogative that. And it was all because a pop star wrote a hit with the word in the chorus. But that's pop prowess, pop awareness. When you can get the world talking like you, or talking like you sing, or talking with the lyrics you use, you've not only made it, but you've created a movement. And I think that's what this song did by Bobby Brown. So 3 songs released in 1988 that not only presaged the 1990s, but they, I think, were part of a handful of tracks that began that initial nudge in that direction. Straight Up by Paula Abdul, My Prerogative by Bobby Brown, and You Got It, The Right Stuff by New Kids on the Block. I'm Michael Douglas. If you like what you see here on the channel, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. And as the late great Barry White used to say, let the music play, and I'll see you on the next episode.